I think it's an interesting course to go down, and it was enlightening as I think about where we should go as an industry. Darrell Holtkamp and others have brought to our attention consistently the cost of the disease. If we compare that to PRV or pseudorabies, $30 million annually. For PRV, $664 million annually for PRRS. You have to ask yourself, why don't we move forward? I also thought it would be interesting to take a look at a couple of other diseases given what we've just gone through in the U.S. with PED. In a summary of 30 herds that our group did, when we have PED strain 1, it's $200 a sow. If we have variant strain or porcine delta coronavirus, it's $100 a sow, plus or minus $10 on either side of them, using $40 weaned pig at that time for the analysis. At the bottom of this slide, I've also got what happens if we get CSF. Estimations from Parberg, 2009, $5.1 billion over 10 years. FMD, $199 billion over 10 years. We know that both viruses affect the performance of the pig that contribute then to the economic losses. And actually they parallel each other, but with different intensities. Average daily gain, feed conversion, increased antibiotic usage, abortions, pre-weaning mortality, wean to finish mortality. A study published by Glaber gave us an indication using his assumptions and carcass information that PRRS cost us $12.87 or 85 cents per head. Recent study coming out of Tokyo University of Agriculture and Technology, average daily gain difference between the positives and the negatives for PRRS of 21 pounds. We can't refute the cost of this virus. If we take a look at the swine health monitoring, we have reasons for optimism. If we take a look at the right side of this screen, the last 2 years, we've had a decline in terms of active PRRS episodes in the sow herds. This year, in my mind, will be critical. If we continue that downtrend, it should be emphasis for us as an industry to say we've put some steps in place to minimize and now think about eliminating the virus. As I think about why that could be, well, we have an increased number of herds that are filtration. By my estimation, the industry is producing somewhere around 8 million pigs from filtered herds. We know that occasionally we get PRRS introduction into filtered herds, but generally the technology has been very, very solid. That number will continue to grow. We know that the PED brought us a lot of intensity, so we intensified our biosecurity. Probably had a good effect on the reduction of PRRS. We know that we had different weather last year. Now, I was reminded this morning, Paul Yeske and I were on a conference call on PED, and Brett Marsh, who is a state veterinarian in Indiana, said this is a great pseudorabies weather. And so it really doesn't change. It's a great PRRS weather transmission today, at least in the Midwest. High humidity, fog, low velocities. One of the things that comes to my attention when I look at this description of the herds in the swine health monitoring program is that of a little bit of concern. If I look at the positive unstable compared to the class 4s, which would be negative. Even though we've had a downward trend the last 2 years, we haven't shifted those categories like I would expect. I believe there is some shift, that we're probably not good about the discipline of changing those categories. And I also think that we probably need to go use the AASV definition, which has a category for vaccination plus weaning PRRS negative pigs. Lost in this description would be under 2V. That would include both vaccinated and natural exposed populations in that category. If this is real, where we haven't shifted, then that would be a concern as we think about moving forward. We know the industry's changed. So what I did was take 3 time periods, 1975 through 2013. So we've increased in the U.S. the number of sows farrowing by almost 60%. We've increased the pig crop by 63%. We've increased the inventory of pigs by around 50%. We've decreased the breeding herd inventory significantly. We've increased the market herd inventory by about 50%. All of those play a factor in terms of disease control and elimination. We know the density has changed. I have in front of us 1974 density compared to 2007 density. We know we've shifted our pig populations, particularly the grow-finish populations, to the center of the U.S., and then we've increased other pockets in the southwest and southeast. That trend is likely to continue, will be a negative factor as we think about some elimination programs. Our industry's changed tremendously since that time period. 1975, when we embarked on the first steps of pseudorabies eradication, we didn't have segregated production. Today we do. And that model's being copied for better or for worse around the world. Clearly, we've had a change in operational procedures which would favor disease elimination. We have family farms today, but they're stronger, they're well managed, they're business. They understand just as well as our integrated systems how we have to control. We have production specialization today that we didn't have in 1975. We do have concentration of the structure, which could facilitate biological amplification of viruses. I spent some time this last summer looking at that for a presentation on IPVS, looking at what is the effect of population size, and really what it came down to is that by itself is not a determining factor. It is how we manage the all-in, all-out flow and how we manage the integrity of those populations within the buildings that is more important. One of the things that happens in the U.S. is we move a lot of pigs. It's estimated that 71% of the pigs enter a growing phase at a different location than from which they were born. That presents some uniqueness and presents some opportunities. It also presents rapid dissemination of diseases. If we look at PCV2, we look at PED, we need to understand those risks much more solidly. PRV was actually first clinically identified in 1803, but it was brought to the forefront in 1960. The thought process is very interesting. One is maybe there was a change in virulence of the virus. Sounds like PRRS. There was a reduction in vaccine usage because we were in the process of eliminating hog cholera in the U.S. So potentially we were vaccinating for hog cholera as well as pseudorabies. There was an intensification and a starting and enlargement of the pig populations within the industry. For PRV, our management strategies were very simplified. It was vaccination. We didn't really understand many of the factors that we understand today that we do every day to control disease. Clearly, there's some differences between PRV and PRRS. I would draw your attention to the picture on the left. That's my home farm where I was born and raised. You can see some really high-quality Hereford feedlot steers there, and you can see a 7-way, highly disciplined pig rotation. And at that time, it was very common to run the pigs behind the cattle to recapture the corn that was passed. What we ended up doing was using the cattle as sentinels for pseudorabies, because as you're aware, other species are affected, but they're dead-end host. Probably one of the things that helped solidify the PRV elimination program was this fact alone. People, when they recognized that the virus was dead in another host, whether it was dogs, cats, goats, it was enough to drive them toward a broad-based control program. Whereas with PRRS, we're pigs, we know we have subclinical infections. When we think about the transmission, differences here as well. Primarily via the respiratory tract for PRV, generally moves short distances except with aerosol movement. Environmental survivability is low, limited, resulting in a narrow risk. We're not that lucky with PRRS. It's shed in body fluids, travels easily with our pigs, travels easily in transport, travels easily in aerosol. Dr. D released recently a study that indicated that it might move 175 miles. Hopefully that is the rarity rather than the commonality. We know it commonly transfers in fomites. We didn't have a long period of viremia with PRV. We certainly do with PRRS. Same way with then resulting in different durations of shedding, which then means that there's increased probability of contact between the shedding and the susceptible population. But remember, a big difference for us today is we have segregated production and we got segregated populations via either by barn or by site, whereas we did not during that time period. We know that PRRS may shed for a long period of time, maybe up as long as 25% of the growth period. Vaccines, particularly with pseudorabies, suppress viremia, were quite effective. They do as well with PRRS, but not quite as effective. One of the things as we think about PRRS control and elimination would be that the industry we had and the virus with pseudorabies fit much more nicely into a regulatory framework that was functioning and well understood. We already had a structure that was able to adapt and able to adapt to our production methods. Well, what do we know? Do we know which strains are pathogenic? I would say yes, no, actually on both of these. If we think about what's occurring in China today, there's now a strain that's not protected by the commonly used Bartha vaccine. Same with PRRS. We don't know exactly which virus strains are pathogenic until we get them in pigs and get them in populations. We don't know what induces sterilizing immunity with PRRS. We do know with PRV and with our vaccines that were available, at least in the latter part of the control program. Multiple strains can be present. During the PRV days, we actually weren't looking very much for those strains. But now around the world, we see those being looked at, identified, and then followed. Is homology between the vaccine and field isolate important? I don't believe so with PRV, and I put a question mark down for PRRS. We all recognize we get immunity. We know that when we look at homologous studies, they're better, but yet we're not able to keep up with that out in the populations. We have a host of diagnostic tests, and we have many more today with PRRS. New cases can be prevented in piglets form infected dams by vaccines. Clearly, that's a distinction between PRV and PRRS. The vaccine, PRV vaccine, had some really strong attributes. We recognize that it was developed late as a differential vaccine. It increased the dose, about 1 log necessary to infect pigs. It prevented dam to fetal transmission, thus controlling quite well the infection in newborn pigs. We're not that fortunate in PRRS today. We also recognize that multiple doses of a PRV vaccine bottled up the virus and prevented reemergent viremia and shedding. So that was the background for multiple doses or quarterly doses in sow herds, or 6 and 660, as we referred to an intensive program toward the end of the elimination program. We're not that lucky with PRRS yet. When I think about the limited period of viremia and think about vaccine with PRV, stronger, reduce the transmission, reduce the viremia, sequester the viruses in the ganglia, preventing them from reemerging. Interestingly, we know that stress results in expression of virus. That was recognized fairly early on when sows were mixed and fought in pens post-weaning. It was very common then to see active infection or circulation of virus 1 to 2 weeks after that stress. We recognized that we needed to stall sows, and we recognized, which was common at that time, that we should not run our cull sows with our slaughter pigs, which was also very common because they tended to go to the same market. Today, that's not common and not a factor. What about the steps to eliminate PRRS virus, and how does that compare to what we did with pseudorabies? There's really 3 parts of the program. 1 is to develop a team. 2 is to develop a strategy. And 3 is then to implement the plan. So in the next few slides, what I've done is say, let's take a look at the framework of what we have today. The good thing about each of us in this group is that we have put this framework in by the way we work with our clients and with the industry today. And so you're going to see a tremendous number of similarities. If we look at the development of a PRV advisory committee, that was critical, and I'll go over that a little bit later. On the PRRS side, we've got the ARC programs. There's over 30 of those that have been started and in existence and followed. Both the committee acts only as an advisory. We did have a meeting in 1975 that kicked off the PRV elimination program. We have not had that for PRRS. We had to identify all the positive herds. I would say today, most of us know where our positive herds are. We certainly can know. We did not have premise IDs. We have premise IDs today, and as we all recognize, they're mandatory for our PED control and reporting. We had a procedure of test and removal for PRV, really not practical in my opinion for PRRS. We have vigorous surveillance. We have that today in the ARC programs. We're able to stop spread with those programs. When we look down at the herd level, we've got a whole list of items that were in the PRV elimination program. What I want you to notice is those are in parallel with what we're doing in the ARC program and individual herd programs. Commitment, diagnostic testing plans, communication, much better data transfer, removal of animals through depopulation, partial depopulation, flows. We identified the herds. Obviously, we know those today that are infected with PRRS. Early on, we vaccinated herds twice a year, but once we recognize some of the benefits of the vaccine, that was then intensified to quarterly, and in some cases, toward the end of the program, 660, which was 6 days post-farrowing and 60 days of pregnancy. We're doing the same thing with our PRRS control programs. We're vaccinating generally quarterly. Is it practical to vaccinate all farms once a year? I would say absolutely yes. Is it practical to vaccinate finishers? I'd say absolutely yes, it is. When we look at materials and methods for a program, we have to rely on vaccine to help stimulate or enhance immunity. We have segregated production already in place in a very high percentage of the flows today in the U.S. We know how to reduce stress. That's what we do every day. We monitor herds on a routine basis, whether they're part of an elimination program or not, because we want to know that information to make decisions. In the early years of PRV, we didn't know anything about herd closure. We've already got that in effect today. We use that not only for PRRS, we use that extensively in the last 18 months for PED. We have biosecurity today, much, much more intense, as we know. Almost all producers understand isolation, diagnostic testing. We obviously in the U.S. have negative gilt boar sources, negative semen sources. The rest of the world will follow. So if we want to implement a plan, some comparisons between then the vaccines. So yes, they're available. The differential vaccine for pseudorabies was a big step forward for us, primarily because it eased the concern of the producers about use of a modified live vaccine and then what's going to be the effect on their diagnostic testing. We can differentiate today PRRS through PCRs. Efficacy, probably gold standard with PRV. Effective for PRRS, but not at the level of reducing transmission from dam to fetus, but it clearly does reduce shedding. I mentioned with PRV, clearly documented that it increased the challenge dose necessary to infect pigs. On finishing, we can have the same strategy. We can vaccinate pigs. We know from Scott studies and others, there's a reduction in viremia, a reduction in duration of shedding, improved performance. What we did with PRV is we actually double vaccinated for generally 1 6-month time period. When I looked at the program and compared it to what we're doing today from employee and grower training, these are really what we do as veterinarians every day. So we learn from pseudorabies. We learn the discipline necessary. And these are now part of our PQA programs that you and I interact with on a daily basis. We've improved our biosecurity, not necessarily directly as a result of pseudorabies, but as a control method for PRRS and other pathogens that we try to minimize. At that time, we were able to do area control. Today, we've had tremendous cooperations in the areas. It's still going to be a hurdle as we think about movement of pigs in clean versus infected regional control programs. Similarly with herd management, notice they're all the same. We've already got those steps in place. We do them every day. Herd additions, we're doing those every day. It's just good biosecurity, protecting the herd, protecting the investments. On the environmental side, when I compared our pseudorabies control program, our elimination program, to what we would have and do have in place for PRRS, likewise, they're already in place. If anything, we've intensified them over the last 18 months. One thing we did when we looked at the risk of PED in slaughterhouses, we noticed, or we identified, that we do get cross-contamination from dirty trucks that come, clean trucks that follow, and then leave the plant. We all accept that we don't allow pigs back on the truck and the trailer, but in actuality, we need some change in regulations and policies and procedures, because slows and downers do occur, DOAs do occur. We've got to figure out how to get those off of the truck. It takes more than one person. We don't have enough truck washes to clean and disinfect, but yet just recently we found additional methods to clean, disinfect trailers that look to be satisfactory, at least for PED and hopefully for PRRS. In the U.S., we have built a number of truck washes this year, but it's still not enough. When you do the physical calculation of the number of trucks we have to wash, if we're going to wash every slaughter truck, we're not there yet. That may not be the critical driver, though. We need to wash the ones that transfer our breeding stock, our weaned pigs, cull sows, first cuts out of the barn. We don't have a gene-deleted vaccine yet with PRRS. Clearly, that was an advantage that we had with PRV. What about successes? I hope you're all aware that Chile went through an eradication program for PRRS, actually initiated in 2000. They just recently had another introduction. They're in the process of eliminating PRRS again. But what's interesting to me is exactly the same steps that I've outlined on the previous slides. So in their case, they use pad wrap. We've all got access to that. They strengthen their biosecurity programs. They set up areas for second cleaning of vehicles to avoid risk sources. They put in place a strict surveillance program on all the herds. As I think about cost, as I started, this is what's driving the industry in Chile. Potential risk of disease on the rest of the pig industry due to dissemination of the virus. They export, will have an impact on trade balance. They also recognize that the control of the disease entails high cost for the industry and the country. They had to have agreement, as we always do, between producers and health authorities. Health authorities were able to make a financial contribution. What have we done here in the U.S.? 2 slides just summarizing. These were reported last year at this meeting. The area regional control programs, 30 of them, I think, in existence. They have the same steps. So they have the goals of the producers in the region. We know these programs have got to be driven by our producers. They understand the current status and the constraints in that region. They develop a solution for the region. They implement and monitor the regional process. So we can look at it 1 herd, 2 herds, 10 herds, 30 herds to define that region. The framework is actually the same as what we had with pseudorabies. So a coordinator makes it work. Extensive communication plans, education. I was present at some of those early meetings with pseudorabies. There was no consensus among the veterinary community because there was unknowns, just like there's unknowns today with our PRRS program. But there was a shared trust. What are we doing more regionally? Well, in Illinois, we've started a Illinois Swine Health Network designed to track and move us forward in exactly this type of disease control. More broader base than PRRS, but clearly a component. So as I think through, this is what, the 20th year for this symposium. We've come a long way with PRRS. The 660 worked well for PRV. Veterinarians like Ralph Vincent and myself tried it for PRRS. It was not as satisfactory at that time. There was just enough difference in the viral dynamics, and we didn't understand subpopulations like early on like we do today. We certainly have a better understanding of the spread of the virus. We've got better diagnostic capabilities than we had with PRV. We're much better at understanding the immunity. So as I compare then the successes needed, great coordination, high producer participation, high degree of transparency and trust. The producer has to help fund this. I don't see us in the U.S. receiving funding from our government today. We have to, one by one, look at a reduction in positive sites. So in closing, where do we go? We know the strategies that we have that have been successful. We can load, close, and expose. We had a lot of discussions 10 years ago about the use of modified live vaccine in the presence of live virus in herds and what that really means. I think most of us today would say that's not been problematic. It's not created a different virus as far as we can tell. We're skilled at load, close, and vaccinate. We continue to execute filtration. As I mentioned, I believe somewhere around 8 million pigs today are produced. When you think about that, we'll soon be somewhere in that 10% range. And those are pigs that are going to be produced generally in the high-risk areas, so the high PRRS repeatability areas. We've got to emphasize cost. As I stand here and I look at the cost of PRRS compared to the other viruses, I would say it should be enough to drive us forward. It's hard to continue to accept as we look at our competitiveness worldwide on a protein market and say that we should not step forward and do everything we can to eliminate this virus. We can look around the world at other countries that are established geographically better than the U.S. They have some advantages if they're negative to PRRS as well as other common diseases. We're going to have a checkoff to fund this. Well, what about the hurdles? And then what are some solutions? Clearly, we have the long viremia. We need to step forward and say we're going to vaccinate, commit for a period of time. We're going to load close for a period of time, and we'll evaluate our results as we go along. We don't have a differential vaccine. We can sequence the viruses. We need commitment. We can extend our ARC programs. We need to continue to eliminate it from the sow population. We've already had tremendous education intensification of biosecurity. I would challenge us to say it's time. PED has reemphasized to me, Paul, that we got the best veterinary group in the world. We've got the best researchers. We've got the best action. We continue to drive toward an endpoint. When I think back of the success stories we've had at eliminating disease, every veterinarian has been successful, whether it's mycoplasma, brachiospira, atrophic, progressive atrophic rhinitis, mange, whatever. We've had a long history of success. We shouldn't let this one restrict us. We should embrace it. We have the best biosecurity in the world. We have a hurdle that we move a lot of pigs. But yet, I think all of us recognize that we can't control the aerosol movement or transmission except through regional control. But yet, day in and day out, we're able to stop movement of viruses by just the basic things that we do. Separate the buildings, separate the rooms, separate the people, Danish changes. Sure, they fail sometimes, but they succeed more than they fail. We've got diagnostics that are more than adequate. We know we've had pilot projects that's been successful. I got input from this group on the board. It's always good to look at more mature veterinarians than yourself. Steve Henry, Ralph Vincent, Richard Hall, Leroy Beal, all strong Illinois veterinarians. You might not recognize them, but Steve Henry actually started out in Illinois. And then there just wasn't room enough for him, so he moved to Kansas and turned out to be, I guess, a satisfactory move for him. But then Arnie Taff, who was our state veterinarian and took charge of the program, pseudorabies eradication program. So I would throw down the challenge that we should quit avoiding the cost of PRRS. We should continue to drive forward with the tools we have today. I'd again emphasize that I was a starting practitioner in the years of pseudorabies, and I was scared in those meetings because I didn't understand how those Kent Kissling-Berries and Jim Dick and Ralph Vincent, how they could be arguing and be on opposite sides of the fence. But at the end of the day, we got a consensus. The same questions remain there in those meetings. We don't have all the questions. What about this? What happens if this happens? We can wait forever to get those questions answered. I hope out of these kind of meetings will come some of those answers and we can move forward.